Completely needless controversy was sought to be created on the Prime Minister visiting the G7 summit. Silly charges were being hurled against him, that he's trying to go and project his own image and that he doesn't deserve to go. This summit meeting was set much before the Indian elections had concluded. Had the opposition parties managed to form a government, the person they would have elected as Prime Minister would have actually represented India at the G7 summit. To be invited even as part of the outreach program of this club, I think is a great honor to India. The hype on the part of the governing coalition in India is also as misplaced as the nonsensical criticism coming from the opposition side. You cannot simply, talk down to India. You cannot simply instruct India to do something. India has to be in the room. India has to be consulted. India has to be part of a consensus. The Indian voice carries a lot more weight today. After getting elected as the Prime Minister for his third term, Prime Minister Modi left for Italy for the G7 summit, where he was invited as part of the G7's outreach program. Now, there are two aspects to that particular visit. One is, of course, the kind of churlishness that we have seen in domestic politics, where a completely needless controversy was sought to be created on the Prime Minister visiting the G7 summit. All kinds of silly charges were being hurled against him, that he's trying to go and project his own image and that he doesn't deserve to go, etc., etc. The bottom line of this is, and why this is such a puerile debate, is that this invitation did not come after the elections. This summit meeting was set much before the Indian elections had concluded, and the fact of the matter is that the invitation was for the Prime Minister of India. Had the opposition parties managed to form a government, the person they would have elected as Prime Minister, if they managed to elect one in time, would have actually represented India at the G7 summit. But the fact is that the numbers that were thrown up through a government in India, in which Mr. Modi gets to become Prime Minister for a third term, and as a result, since the invitation was for the Prime Minister of India and he is the Prime Minister of India, he has gone to represent India. So I think that needs to be very clear. Secondly, on the government side, again, there was that typical kind of hype about Mr. Modi going and attending the G7 summit, as though this was some kind of a G7 plus one kind of a deal. It wasn't. The G7 is the world's most exclusive club. It is the club of the 7 most powerful economies in the world. Actually, they are not all the most powerful. The second largest economy in the world, China, is not part of the G7, but the G7 countries actually control the bulk of the world economy, and that is why it's such an exclusive club, a very powerful club, and to be invited even as part of the outreach program of this club, I think is a great honor to India, not to an individual but to the country itself. That, I think, should also be very clear. Again, it was not as though it was only Mr. Modi who was invited. There were almost a dozen other countries whose leaders were also part of this outreach program, including Argentina, which has a new president who's really making the waves, Brazil, there was Saudi Arabia, there was UAE, a number of other countries had been invited as part of this program. So again, the hype on the part of the governing coalition in India is also as misplaced as the nonsensical criticism coming from the opposition side. Now, the important part from an Indian point of view is that in the last almost in the last 10 years, there have been at least 6 or 7 occasions, I might be getting the number wrong, where India has been part of the G7 deliberations, not as part of the inside circle, but has been consulted and has been invited to G7 summits. And that, I think, is a recognition of India's rising stature, both at the economic level and as a kind of a critical swing state in global politics, in global economics, and on global issues. So, for example, when you are confronted with big global issues of our times, including something like climate change, you cannot simply, talk down to India. You cannot simply instruct India to do something. India has to be in the room. India has to be consulted. India has to be part of a consensus, because with 15-16% of the world population, you simply cannot ignore India. So, India has to be part of the solutions and not be considered a problem. So, the Indian voice carries a lot more weight today, both on these global issues, also on economic issues, where India becoming the 5th largest economy, going on to become the 3rd largest by the end of the decade, is something that nobody can ignore anymore. So, I think this is extremely important for the other countries in the world to be seen to be holding consultations with India and coming up with solutions going forward. So, I think that is something that we really need to recognize on how things are moving on the global stage. I think we also need to recognize that this was an occasion, given the fact that Mr. Modi, although he is the Prime Minister, he's become Prime Minister with a somewhat reduced mandate, and I think he's now for the first time going to be running a coalition government. I'm sure players in the global system, India's global partners, would be wanting to meet him to see how much of how much he is going to be in control, how much he is going to be able to call the shots. So, I think there will be some amount of measuring up of Mr. Modi, but at the same time, it also gives India a chance to measure up what's going to be happening with some of these most important countries of the world, all of which are facing their own major political problems, crises. They are facing major security issues, and their economies are not really in the pink of health. Their economies are actually in deep trouble. And politically also, apart from the kind of burning issues in these countries, most of the leaders of these G7 countries are pretty much at the bottom of as far as popularity goes. Mr. Biden, nobody knows whether he is going to be able to win the election come November. The British Prime Minister is fighting what many see as a losing election in July. We've had results in Europe during the European elections, and except for the governing coalition in Italy led by the Italian Prime Minister Meloni, everybody else, the Germans and the French ruling parties, have suffered major reverses. And of course, in Canada, you have Justin Trudeau, who is probably the single most unpopular Prime Minister in Canadian history. I might be exaggerating a bit, but I don't think I'm exaggerating the fact that he is deeply unpopular, because he has poshed up Canada. So, I think this also gives Mr. Modi and the Indian establishment a chance to measure up their partners in the West, and of course, meet other players in the international system, UAE, Saudi Arabia and others, which are very critical partners for India going forward. So, I think the summit meeting does not need to be made about Mr. Modi. The summit meeting needs to be made about what it holds for India, what is the direction in which the world is going to be moving, how does India maximize its own interests the kind of new realignments taking place, the kind of churn that is taking place in the world. How does India traverse this very treacherous path that is ahead of us going forward? So I think those are the critical issues. Those are the issues we should have been discussing, rather than dumbing it all down to why Modi has been invited, whether Modi should go or not, with what face will Modi go. The same questions can be asked: with what face has Macron come? With what face has Rishi Sunak come to this summit? And if the contention is that because somebody claimed that they will get a certain level of seats or majority in an election and they don't get that, that means that they are not entitled to represent India in international forums. Frankly, it's the most illogical thing I've ever heard. But that is what the opposition seems to be suggesting. So I think the elections are over. There will be opposition in India, as there should be. There is a lot to criticize the government, and of course it is the duty of the opposition to do that. But do it on sensible issues. Don't do it on this kind of stuff. It really doesn't add to the debate. It debases the debate that we should be having in India.